Thank you and welcome everyone to this informative webinar on emerging trends in nonprofit engagement. Change is the only real constant in the world of technology, and today's speakers will bring their insight into how constituent engagement and fundraising are being altered by the rapid developments we all face in digital, mobile, social, and omni-channel worlds. Today's session is sponsored by StratusLIVE. Constituent lifecycle management and fundraising and marketing strategies to reach organizational goals will be uncovered by panelists Jim Fineri and Chris Johnson. As co-founder and CEO at StratusLIVE, Jim Fineri brings more than 25 years of experience in finance and technology and nonprofits, transportation, financial, and services-related industries. Most recently, he was president and Chief Executive Officer of Compass Technology, a leading provider of integrated CRM solutions to nonprofits. Joining Jim is Chris Johnson, who leads the marketing team at StratusLIVE. The majority of his professional experience has centered on solving problems through building teams, improving processes, and bringing new products and services to the market. In nonprofit leadership, Chris currently volunteers and serves at multiple nonprofits and sits on 2 different boards. He has served in senior consulting roles to several national nonprofits, and as a professional fundraiser, has raised millions of dollars in support of various causes. To begin our session, Chris?
Thanks, John. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. It sure is a privilege to have you spend a little bit of time with us today. To get started, let's cover a few housekeeping items. I think we've already mentioned that we'll be making a recording of the webinar, and we will also make a slide deck available afterwards if anyone wants to get that. Certainly welcome to contact me. We'll have some contact information at the end. Today, as we discuss emerging trends and best practices, it's our hope that we leave you with some really valuable thoughts about best practices, along with some strategies and some tactic items that you can put into daily use, just as soon as we're done right away. And with that in mind, I will hand it off to Jim.
Thanks, Chris. And thank you, John, and the team at Nonprofit Times for arranging today's webinar. I'd like to welcome also the audience from around the country. We appreciate the chance to explore some of our thoughts on the emerging trends at work in our nonprofit marketplace. Obviously, these trends are forcing all of us to reevaluate our strategy and tactics across processes, across technology, our human resources on this journey toward best practices. So in today's agenda, we are going to look at some important marketplace trends, kind of at a macro level, if you will. And many of these trends obviously are affecting all markets, not just the nonprofit market. We see these trends in commercial and public sector as well. But they do represent some challenges and some opportunities that we should be addressing. And then we'll explore some potential best practices that you might consider adopting in your nonprofit. Some of these best practices have been identified and explored by others in the industry. The list is by no means exhaustive, but we think it is representative of the views that we've developed over several years in working with nonprofits across the country. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a Q&A session. Yep. So let's get started and look at some of these trends that are emerging, and let's start with the obvious, one that's front and center for just about every thinking person in our nonprofits, and that's social networks. Obviously, these numbers are truly staggering in terms of the potential audience, as you can see in the graphic. We have Facebook now at over 1.3 billion users. We have Google Plus at over 500 million, Twitter at 270 million. LinkedIn is a very tremendous opportunity in the professional realm with 200 million, Instagram as well at the same, and then Pinterest at 53 million. And then if we look at internet search, this is clearly the entry point, the front door, if you will, that our constituents are using to find information of every kind. And you see over 15 billion searches per month between Google and Bing alone. And so, it begs the question we should be asking ourselves daily, can my constituents and potential prospects find my organization, my cause concept, my programs and initiatives? via internet search. And let me emphasize another important point about the graphic. Notice that we've categorized each social network by its primary usage characteristic. So you see this idea of personal, kind of personal and cross-cultural, very individualistic in Facebook. You'll see quick and personal communication via Twitter, obviously, the professional model adopted by LinkedIn for businesses and organizations and profiles within those organizations and individuals. So just keep these categories in mind as you think through your social network content strategy. And we'll explore this a bit more as we get further into the presentation. And then the next mega trend, if you will, along the same theme is our constituents are going mobile and using mobile devices. I think all of you are familiar with this kind of information, but 51% of all email is now opened on a mobile device. And our constituents are using apps, they're conducting transactions, they're interacting and communicating, and consuming information on these devices to the current tune of about 1.5 million terabytes of traffic per month. So look at the projected increase over the next 3 years, and it's very easy to conclude that the mobile device has quickly become the device or channel used by your constituents more than any other. Obviously, again, to reach these constituents, we will need a mobile strategy. We'll need a good understanding of the most effective content and delivery channels, again, which we'll discuss later as we look at best practices. And then further, we have to understand something about this data that's being created. Do we need to understand all of it? No, we're not suggesting that it's necessarily relevant to our constituent engagement and development efforts. However, some of it is, and more of it will be in the future. And that, again, kind of leads us to this idea of the digital data explosion. Scientists tell us now that information doubles every 18 months. And, some of these statistics are really quite mind-boggling. Every minute, every 60 seconds, we create over 200 million email messages, over 600,000 content posts on Facebook, and yes, again, every minute, every 60 seconds, 100,000 tweets, and the list goes on and on. So we're dealing with this huge increase in digital information, and it's becoming more and more integrated or connected into daily life, both for individuals and for businesses and organizations. So, we have this situation where our constituents and prospects are both consumers of this data. Indeed, some would say that they're flooded with the information, the images, and the messages. But they're also creators or producers of some of this data, and that's important to us. It's making digital communication a primary means of conversation and interaction in today's world, and that's important to us as a trend. The next trend that we'd like to discuss is this rapid progression into what is being called an omnichannel environment. And I think the best expression or the best example is that your constituents or your constituent in any given day, any given hour can be viewing an email from you. They can be viewing your website. They can view your social network content. They can receive a direct mail piece and view a blog post, and that is almost simultaneously. So the opportunities to distribute your message, your cause concepts, your mission information, your funding appeals across all these channels simultaneously has never been greater. I mean, these are real opportunities, and the constituents are there on all of these channels. But that opportunity also presents several challenges. And it's important that we work hard at creating a seamless brand experience across these channels. It's equally important that the messaging is consistent, not contradictory. And so we need to create content once and what we'd like to call and think about in a reusable digital format, and then distribute that content content with appropriate refinements across these specific channels. But the constituents are there, and it's omni-channel. Now, the final trend that we'd like to talk about is the importance of what has been called business intelligence or analytics. Collectively, these trends, the previous trends that we've identified, present us with a big challenge. How do we make sense of all this data? How do we filter it? How do we sift it? How do we find meaningful information about constituents and audiences? So obviously, we've got to use this data to inform our strategy and tactics. When Gartner conducted this year's survey of almost 2,400 CIOs across 77 countries, what they found was very interesting. The number one priority among those CIOs is business intelligence and analytics. And so this means that their single most important technology initiative is finding and applying business intelligence solutions in their organizations. Again, to make sense of this explosion of digital data, of what's coming from these social networks and these mobile devices. So just in summary, you can see these are the major trends that we've identified and that we've looked at. Again, the industry obviously is speaking on these trends on a regular basis. We want to begin to work in some best practices, but obviously the constituents are everywhere. They're mobile. This data explosion is real, and we need to sift and filter and make sense of the data. We do that through tools that might be made available through business intelligence and analytical solutions. And these are, again, the trends that we think are shaping our current environment in our nonprofits.
Yeah, so thanks, Jim. As we think through these emerging trends, it really does become then important to emphasize that we've identified a few best practices related to the technology, a few related to business processes, and a few that are related to human and people issues. And certainly the list of emerging trends is not exhaustive, neither is this list of best practices that we'll go through. But we seem to see that these same themes in organizations that are improving their engagement and results, mission delivery, and their fundraising and development efforts. So let's go ahead and turn our attention to some of these best practices.
Yeah, so the first one, Chris, is something that's more cultural and something that we see in organizations that tend to perform well, and that is that these organizations intentionally reevaluate their best practices and their business processes on a regular and systematic basis. So there seems to be this cycle of iterative refinement, if you will, leading to improvement. Obviously, processes are implemented, they're tested, they're measured, they're evaluated, and then, they're refined and changed. And it seems like that poorly performing organizations become fixed and inflexible and somewhat inward-facing, rather than having this curious and kind of open and outward-looking view on things. And I think, the bottom line, maybe the takeaway from this, is the need to reevaluate our practices regularly as we get into some of the details that we look at, because the organizations that adapt most readily in this rapidly changing world seem to be those that are most adept at responding to change. And they're agile, and they intentionally refine their approaches. And, of course, that's clearly the first best practice that we wanted to identify.
Yeah, that's great. So let's get into some specifics related to the nonprofit community. The first thing, let's talk about those infamous information silos.
Silos.
You got to love it.
So a major challenge that we've discovered is that organizations seem to drift into silos. And people and processes tend to be organized into departments or divisions, and sooner or later the silo mentality becomes a real barrier to collaboration. In fact, in a recent study, 70% of the respondents in that study cited the need to increase productivity as the number one goal, or the need to increase collaboration, as the number one goal for increasing productivity. So it's this idea around collaboration, becoming collaborative, fostering teamwork, promoting information sharing, and then looking at enabling solutions that lead to better collaboration. So in essence, we're tearing the walls down, and we're working on this issue of collaboration.
Right. You know what's interesting about that, Jim, is that that as you said early on, the business requirement says there are certain people that do certain things, and so they need certain sets of tools and stuff. But there's got to be a way to get beyond that. So let's talk about how do you tear down silos, and let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, yeah, it's not just that people and processes tend to drift into silos, but the other thing that happens is that data tends to organize and drift into silos. And that absolutely happens, and it's reflected in what we see as kind of the family photo many times as we go into nonprofits, where these point solutions, these individual point solutions, are used to capture information and manage the business. And this graphic is kind of typical of that family photo, where each one of these solutions represents a different system. It could represent a different set of technologies. It could represent different user interfaces. And we find that just creates this silo mentality. Of course, you know, each of these systems or applications require interfaces or integrations. That's the plumbing, if you will. And that's what you see in the lines connecting each of these point solutions. Those are the hidden costs. Those are the hidden integrations and interfaces that make this silo so difficult to deal with, and all the time and efforts expended in keeping things in sync. And so each additional point solution here, Chris, always adds additional cost. It adds time delays typically, and it creates the potential for errors, the risk of errors, whether it's duplicated data or missing data. So, you know, we have been working on this issue for a number of years of a single comprehensive enterprise solution. And, you know, building an enterprise class platform is a really hard and really expensive proposition. 10 to 15 years ago, the commercial market, the commercial organizations moved to these enterprise class commercial platforms for most of their line of business applications. And in fact, almost no proprietary systems survived. So we think that today, 10 or 15 years later, we're seeing the evolution where nonprofits have the opportunity to adopt a major commercial platform for their line of business software, such as, for example, the Dynamics platform from Microsoft, and that's the platform on which we've built our solution at StratusLIVE, and obviously we think it's a very powerful solution. But for example, Microsoft is able to use its vast scale, its development and programming resources to build this comprehensive platform, and then to invest, for example, at the tune of about $10 billion in research, development, and acquisition just in the last 2 to 3 years. And that obviously dwarfs the R&D of any other nonprofit application company. Yeah, right. So it creates this much larger community or ecosystem of applications, of developers, of educational materials. And, you know, it's just what we think is really the new software model for organizations and line of business applications.
Yeah, Jim, we see that all the time where organizations, you know, by leveraging these commercial platforms like this, you're just able to get so much more bang for the buck on the underlying technology and all the stuff that it really solves a lot of those problems. And just point out to the audience real quick, you know, Jim has written a white paper. He wrote it a little bit ago, but it still serves extremely well. And the people so when you get the slide deck, there's a link here for you. If you'd like to go download that, certainly we would welcome you to do that. Jim, these leveraging these platforms and getting rid of the silos, that kind of leads us into the next practice, which is kind of common sense, but you have to be intentional to make it happen, and that's about streamline and simplify.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is an objective that we're seeing quite often as we go in. You look at the chart here, and when organizations are evaluating their next purchase, their next nonprofit software enterprise application, they really are concerned about improving efficiencies, becoming more efficient, and having better integration. And again, that is part and parcel with the enterprise platform, but it's also about simply streamlining business processes. And here, obviously, the issue is encouraging staff input, listening to the frontline people who most often see where there are redundant processes, the processes that have gone amok, if you will, getting those replaced, and then really focusing on some of the higher value activities that the software, the solution can provide for you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, Jim, I'm going to make a little bit of a pivot here into another best practice, another area. You know, in the emerging trends, you talked a lot about data, omnichannel, distribution network, some of this kind of marketing stuff, but that really all revolves around this central idea of getting the right message to the right people at the right time. And that really kind of sums up this whole idea of content marketing. So let's talk about content marketing a little bit.
Yeah, so again, across many organizations, both commercial and nonprofit, this priority around content marketing is becoming so important. You've heard the expression, content is king. Well, that saying's never been more relevant. And again, in another recent survey, some market research of nonprofits, 92% of nonprofits said they need to prioritize the content marketing strategy within their organization. However, there appears to be a real disconnect in this answer if you look at the next two charts related to implementation, because only 42% of these organizations said they were actually putting resources or time against that priority. And then further, only 25% of that group said that they actually had a documented content marketing strategy. And, you know, we think it's clear, and we're seeing this in a number of instances, that if we plan to take advantage of you know, this mobile, social, omni-channel world, then we need to focus on our content marketing strategy, on creating original high-value content, and on getting back to the fundamentals in what we're communicating. And, you know, again, the important things I like to emphasize, and what I think we see the best results, is reinforcing and communicating the cause, engaging the constituent in a personal way, and then demonstrating your performance and your impact in generating outcomes. Telling a story is a great way to do that. Seems to be very effective among many of our clients and the people that we've worked with in the industry. Now, along the same lines here, and again, this is just supplemental to the previous slide, it is certainly important that you ensure that your content and your channels are aligned. You really do need to pick them and match the content medium to the preferred channel. You can just see from the graph here that, you know, there's probably kind of a leading group of three, with social media and website articles and e-newsletters in use as the top content marketing channels or mediums. And then you've got videos coming on strong, and probably the highest increases or the greatest increases in this area of video and rich media in terms of communicating the story. And then kind of followed by some other things that, you know, are more traditional, fit into print and, you know, article posting, things like that. But it's just truly important, and this is one that you'll have to do as an exercise within your own nonprofit, depending on what your cause is, what channels are open to you and in use, and what kind of content you have to deliver. But this alignment is worth the investment in analysis and determining what's the best bang for the buck here.
That's right. And Jim, what's interesting is that as we see more and more, not just distribution channels, but as individuals are creating their own content and distributing that and referencing your brand maybe in a Facebook post when they do a video at an event or something like that. What's really important is we see more and more and more of these touch points. It also then allows us to gather more information. And the more information that we gather, that allows us to move beyond some of these traditional fundraising models.
That's right, Chris. And again, we want to maintain a lot of what we've done in terms of measurements and strategies from the traditional fundraising engagement models. Certainly aligning cost concepts and interest, donor interest, that's critical. Having programs that are intentional and measured and looking at outcomes around acquisition, lift, and retention, lifetime value metrics, RFM metrics, which we'll talk about in just a bit. But what we seem to be focused on now, and what's important that we're doing, is to kind of extend this experience out into various means of engagement, and these we call the non-financial interactions and participations. It could be events, it could be volunteerism, it could be any number of engagement opportunities that you have. How are your constituents referring others? Acting as an influencer, we really need to be measuring and looking at those. What's the interaction trend analysis? Are your interactions increasing, decreasing, staying flat? Do you have these things that would lead us to believe that there's a healthy engagement score there? And all that together, we think, combines to really maximize or optimize our fundraising and operational performance.
All right. Okay. And so as a specific example, let's talk about how our guests on the call today might go, maybe go beyond RFM into more of a lifecycle management type process.
Yeah, so as we mentioned earlier in the discussion about the explosion of digital data, we're really faced with a much more holistic set of information about constituents. In the past, we've been focused on demographic information and campaign responses and transactions. You'll see that highlighted in the blue. And of course, the prevailing analytical model has been around RFM analysis, which is recency, frequency, and monetary value. But now we have access to a much broader set of data and attributes and a much more holistic potential picture here that would include all of these things in the green as just samples that you might employ. And, enriched data, third-party data services, all of this data can be collected through the web, through API services now to really enrich that profile that we maintain about our donors, and allows us, again, to move beyond just the transactional, the RFM kind of analytical models.
Right, and it's so easy. Having been a fundraiser, I can tell you it's so easy just to kind of go back to what you used yesterday and then just make a few more phone calls. But the truth is, we just have to be very intentional, and we really do have to gather the data, harness the data, and let's talk about how we can use data for better decision making.
Yeah, so based on the emerging trends that we discussed earlier, it seems obvious that we could do much better if we could consume and analyze data more effectively, making sense of the relevant information that guides our decision making about our constituents, about what's working, about what's not working. And, the question is this really true? Data-driven decision-making, is it really better or not? And this theory was substantiated in a recent comprehensive study of about 400 large companies, again, across a number of vertical industries by Bain Consulting. And so here's what Bain found. They found a number of clear benefits and results from the companies that really did adopt advanced analytics, business intelligence, and use data-driven decision-making. They tended to outperform their peer companies by very wide margins in the following ways. They were 5 times more likely to make faster decisions. They were 3 times more likely to execute as intended, that is, according to their plan. And they were twice as likely to improve their financial performance.
Wow.
Yeah. So data-driven decision-making, clearly a best practice and one that we want to be constantly tuning and improving in our nonprofits. Obviously, the real objective, better decision-making.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive. So you have all the data, and you're using it to help you inform better decision-making. But obviously, you're going to have some way of kind of guiding and navigating through that process.
Correct. And on this best practice, one of the things that we found, again, in working with nonprofits over the last number of years is that it seems universally organizations that continually improve have key indicators and instrumentation, if you will, and we're using kind of the flight instrumentation model here, and that serves as their guidance system. So, these key indicators, these monthly dashboards, assist in monitoring constituent engagement, mission delivery, fundraising results. All of those things are critical to know kind of where we are. Are we gaining altitude? Are we losing altitude? Are we performing better? And so forth. And certainly we have produced and are using and have seen these types of analyses used as part of these dashboards in the areas of engagement. Again, we just mentioned that. How healthy is the engagement across these constituents or segments of constituents? Capacity, wealth analysis, wealth screening. What's the capacity of our prospects and our constituents? Churn, where is it that the turnover is occurring and why? And then, of course, outcomes related to cultivation processes and moves management, all of those important. And then the traditional one that we're focused on, how are the campaigns and appeals and so forth performing. But once you measure these, then you can optimize the tactics that might lead to improvement. We see this really in the organizations that are performing well. They have this kind of instrumentation.
Yeah. So that's excellent. And, this idea that organizations, this really kind of leads to an idea that organizations probably need to employ a mix of people, processes, and technology and change in those issues that really help them with things like building teamwork. And in many cases, we probably need to really consider who can help us fill some of the integrated roles that are going to be necessary to navigate these waters of new technologies, new emerging trends, and new best practices.
Exactly, yeah. And in fact, this, we chose this as kind of the final best practice to discuss because it applies to both organizations and individuals. So this one is actually very personal. It's a personal best practices for those in our audience that are working in nonprofits. For all of us to consider with respect to our own skills and competencies. And so, it goes like this. The emerging trends that we've seen, we talked about earlier, it's clear that we need to be, and you can say it a couple of different ways. You can say that we need to be technology savvy marketers, or maybe marketing savvy technologists.
Right.
Choose your term there, but this idea that we're seeing an intersection of marketing and technology is really the new reality. And, nonprofits must realize that both our teams and our individuals that are part of those teams must possess this good combination of the creative, the technical, and the analytical. All three of those, are critical.
Right.
And we're hearing this often from organizations large and small. So we felt it was really important to identify this one as kind of the final best practice in the list. It's a takeaway for all of us in a very real sense that we need the constant refinement and retooling to be relevant in today's kind of connected, information-rich world.
Yeah, that's right. And even in the marketing department that I run, we're constantly looking to hire people, but we're also looking to take the people that we have, and maybe they'll have a skill set in a certain way. Maybe they're highly creative, but need some boost in the technical. We're investing dollars and time and resources intentional. It's so important, and it needs to be done in all the different. We're talking about a marketing technologist, but really across the board, we need to just make sure that we're really focusing in that technology is so critical in the future.
Yeah, and some organizations are large enough that they have teams where they can get specialties in creative, they can get specialties in technology,
Right.
They can get specialists in analytics. But boy, those teams need to be working so closely together. They need to be fully integrated, and clearly they need to have an understanding and appreciation of what the other does. And today's marketing world is going to really rest, I think, on the success of those skill building, competency building activities.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So let's go through a quick summary here, Jim. And I won't go into. We're gonna distribute the slide deck, right? So yeah. I won't bore everyone by going back and reading through all of these. But clearly, I think the overriding emerging trends kind of speak to some changes and some things that we need to evaluate in the nonprofit community that help us work together as teams, help us understand the information, help us reach the right people with the right message at the right time. And I think as we do those things and then we measure and then we optimize the performance against those measurements, that's really what it's about for building for the future. So that's what we have for the moment. John, I see that we have some questions here.
Yes, and I want to thank you and Jim for an excellent presentation. Several of the questions relate to small shops. The first one being is, how does a small organization that does not have the capital invest in analytic technology?
Well, I would, yes. So more and more we're seeing solutions that are delivered via the internet, what we would call SaaS, software as a service, or internet-based solutions that could be very effective, both in data warehousing and analytics. Some of the solutions actually that we've selected to use for Microsoft are quite inexpensive. I would reference one that is shipped and delivered with Office 2013, specifically Excel 2013, a product called Power View, and a complete suite of BI tools, which again available online, called Power BI. So I think we're seeing readily available tool sets at very good price points that can help the small shop.
Great. The other one relates to a small trade association who actually asked an interesting question about being able to implement these concepts with limited resources, people and money, and a membership base that is generally not technologically savvy. Good question. Well, I think that's part of the audience analysis that you would want to do in selecting your channels. If the audience indeed is at one end of the spectrum or continuum in terms of their sophistication and use, for example, of social networks and social channels, then you need to devise appropriate content strategies and select channels that are effective with that group. Despite all of the information, the data that indicate this rapid rise in social networking and mobile devices and so forth, certainly there's still a segment of the population, segment of the universe that maybe isn't coming along quite so quickly. So I would still say that internally you need to work carefully in identifying that audience, understanding where they are in that continuum, and then tailoring your content strategies and your channel distribution appropriately. Would you suggest the use of data dashboards or other dashboards to stop the use/building of information silos to spread ownership of information? That one's packed quite full. Obviously, we're a big fan of dashboards and this whole idea of instrumentation that is at a reasonably high level in the organization. The big problem is if you ask a question about results or statistics, you can easily get 4 answers in any nonprofit depending on who you ask, or 10 answers. I think the more important strategy is to work at getting some of those point solutions out and getting an enterprise kind of comprehensive solution so that you don't have these silos proliferating and containing important information that's necessary for those dashboards.
So, there are two parts to the strategy. Yes, you need to, establish the metrics, establish the instrumentation, have some technology that can deliver that. But fundamentally, if you still have all the information isolated in these silos, you still have quite the integration problem and the problem of incorrect, inconsistent reporting.
Right. And, Jim, just to add to that, the staff is so hamstrung when you have these disparate solutions, they can't give leadership the answers in consistent ways. I mean, you just can't get the information that you need in a summary form and then share the same information to get that single view of your constituent or the single view of your fundraising efforts or performance. You just can't get it because the systems won't allow it when they're all disconnected.
Great.
Okay.
There was a national study published recently on donor management systems and their integration with CRM, and one of the major dissatisfactions was that a lot of these CRM systems don't connect up with mobile giving, which is a growing trend. Can you speak to whether you think that mobile giving is going to continue to grow as a percentage as a channel?
Yes, we do. We think mobile giving is definitely a part of the future. It is something I think that you should, have a strategy around. Now, again, I can't speak for every nonprofit, again, within each of the various segments and niches within the nonprofit market, but by and large, you just see the rise of the mobile device and how people are beginning to use that for more and more and more transactions. And we have developments in payment systems that you're seeing that are trying to solve some of these problems around security and the use of credit cards. And I just think this whole area is really an area that's going to develop very quickly. You see, companies like Apple obviously working in this area, many venture-funded Silicon Valley-type organizations, and I won't name those, but all working on payment processing and how it can be more seamless and more integrated from the mobile device.
Great. I want to thank Jim Fineri and Chris Johnson for an excellent presentation, and that concludes our session for today.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.